The market is loud this morning. You're standing at the edge of Covent Garden in the autumn of 1878. The noise arrives before you've found your footing. Vendors calling in at least 4 languages, iron wheel barrows clattering on wet cobblestones, the high, thin cry of a flower girl somewhere off to your left. The air holds chrysanthemums and coal soot and something earthier underneath. The permanent smell of a city that runs on effort and never quite gets clean, no matter how polished the shop fronts look. There is a woman moving through the crowd ahead of you. She's 26, plainly dressed in a coat mended at the cuffs, carrying a small cloth bag and the careful, practiced steadiness of someone who has learned to take up very little space. She doesn't look remarkable. That is the whole point of her. A Victorian governess was the only person in the house with no room to belong to. Too genteel for the servants' table, too employed for the families. She ate alone in silence in a house full of people, and no one thought it was strange. This woman has done exactly that for 4 years. She has eaten alone in 3 different households, in 3 different counties, and she has never once complained about it in front of anyone who might repeat it. By the end of tonight, you'll understand what made her dangerous, not her beauty, though she had that, not her birth, she had none worth speaking of. What made her dangerous was something far simpler. She had absolutely nothing to lose, and she had quietly stopped pretending otherwise. The story begins this morning, but to understand it, we need to go back a little further first. She was born Eleanor Ashworth in the winter of 1852, in a house in Shropshire that had once been comfortable, and then, with the speed particular to financial catastrophe, wasn't. Her father was a solicitor of moderate success and poor investment habits. When she was 11, he made 3 decisions in quick succession: a loan, a business partnership, and a venture in railway shares that a more cautious man might have hesitated over. The household unravelled within 18 months. He died of a fever shortly after. Her mother had been gone since Eleanor was 4. There were no relatives willing to take in a child with no dowry and uncertain prospects. There was a charitable school in Chester that accepted daughters of the professional class. Eleanor went there instead. The governess as a social category existed precisely because the Victorian economic system was very good at producing exactly this kind of woman. Bank failures, dead fathers, brothers who inherited what little remained, these things happened with enough regularity that there was an entire institution built around the aftermath. Educated women, women raised to be ladies, women who had been prepared for a world that no longer existed for them, found themselves without money and without any respectable alternative. Manual labour meant total social ruin. Marriage without a dowry was increasingly unlikely. The governess position was the answer that polite society agreed to acknowledge. It was respectable. It was quiet. It was, in almost every practical sense, exhausting. She was expected to teach languages, music, drawing, and the general curriculum of a wealthy girl's education. She was expected to be well-read but not opinionated, accomplished but not competitive. She was required to be in the schoolroom by 8 in the morning and available until the children slept. What she was not required to be, what no household actually needed her to be, was content. The wages reflected this with a kind of honest indifference. A governess in the 1870s earned somewhere between £15 and £50 a year. The exact sum depended on the household, the number of children, and how firmly the lady of the house had persuaded herself that lower wages were somehow more principled than higher ones. From this income, she was expected to dress appropriately for her station, save against illness or a period between posts, and prepare for dismissal at any moment without notice. Taking a former employer to civil court for unpaid wages was technically possible. It cost more than most governesses earned in a year. Most simply left. One woman documented this life with a precision that most histories prefer not to dwell on. Nellie Wheaton was born in 1776 and spent a significant portion of her adult life working as a governess in the north of England. She was not famous. She was not well connected or beautiful or remarkable in any of the ways that Victorian England recognised. What she was, and what has made her invaluable to anyone trying to understand this particular world from the inside, was a writer. Her journals and letters, covering the years from 1807 to 1825, survived, and they remain one of the most direct accounts of governess life written by someone who was living it. In one letter, she recorded, without particular anger, which is somehow more affecting than anger would have been, that on several occasions the family she worked for discussed her in the third person while she sat in the same room, not as a cruelty, not as a deliberate slight, simply as a habit, the way one might discuss a piece of furniture or an arrangement of flowers. She was present. She simply wasn't present in the sense that mattered to them. This was not an aberration. It was the standard. Now, if you're settling in, if the room is getting quiet enough and the pillow is right, I want to pause here for just a moment. There's a candle waiting in this story. At the end of a long corridor in a house we haven't reached yet, we'll find it. But first, a quiet word. If you're finding this worth staying with, I'd love to hear from you before you fall asleep. Leave a comment. I'm curious about something specific to this story. There is a woman in what follows who notices the one thing nobody else in the room has noticed, and I want to know, is there a moment like that in your own life? A time you saw something clearly that everyone around you had decided not to look at? Leave it in the comments, wherever you are tonight, and tell me the hour. If you haven't subscribed yet, one quiet tap before sleep keeps the next story coming. And now, back to the world that made Eleanor Ashworth, and to one of the women who had already, in fiction, turned that world into something that would outlast it. She was not, of course, the only person who had documented it from the inside. There was another writer, a generation later, who had experienced governess life and found language for it, though she chose the language of fiction rather than letters, which turned out to be considerably more durable. Charlotte Brontë worked as a governess in 1839 for the Sidgwick family in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and then again in 1841 for the White family at Upperwood House in Rawdon. She was 23 years old the first time. She was already writing novels that she had not yet managed to publish. She was also, at that point, one of the most acutely observant people in England, which made the experience of being socially non-existent in someone else's household considerably more painful than it might have been for a less attentive person. In letters to her sister Emily written during those placements, she described the work with an honesty she could not have published directly. She described sitting in the family drawing room of an evening as a kind of torment, not because anyone was unkind, but because she was required to be present without being part of anything. She wrote about the children, the demands, the constant management of other people's expectations of her. She wrote about the sensation of watching a household social life proceed around her as though she were a piece of furniture that had been tastefully positioned. She published Jane Eyre in 1847 under the name Currer Bell, because a woman's name on the cover would have been a disadvantage with the reviewing press, and she knew it. The novel's governess, plain, without money or connections, with nothing but a frank intelligence and an absolute refusal to become less than she was, became one of the most recognised figures in English literature. She was recognised because readers knew the feeling she described, even when they had not lived it directly. The specific loneliness of being seen without being seen. The specific dignity of remaining intact inside it. What Bronte had understood, from inside those households, was that invisibility is not the same as passivity. It is a form of attention that accumulates, very quietly and without announcement, into something very like knowledge. A woman who spent enough years in other people's houses learned those houses more accurately than the houses knew themselves. She learned where the power actually was and where it only appeared to be. She learned which silences were empty and which were full. She learned in the end considerably more than anyone who had hired her had intended her to learn. Eleanor Ashworth had understood all of this before she turned 20. She had not read Nellie Wheaton's letters. Few people had at that time. But she had arrived at the same understanding through the simpler and less scholarly method of experiencing it directly. The school in Chester was a serious institution. It had been founded in 1834 by a committee of local men who had recognised a specific and practical problem. The daughters of professional families, when financially ruined, had nowhere to go that was not considerably worse than where they had come from, and had decided with the particular Victorian confidence that practical problems have practical solutions to address it. The endowment was modest, the building was adequate, the curriculum was better than it had any right to be because the headmistress, a Miss Horton, believed with a conviction she pursued against consistent resistance that a girl who was going to have to work for a living should be educated to a standard that made working effectively possible. She substituted bookkeeping for the classical languages that boys learned and girls were not expected to need. She proved, over 20 years of quietly excellent results, that the substitution was correct. Eleanor spent 6 years at the school. She arrived at 11, already quiet in the particular way of children who have lost their domestic structure and recalibrated to something more self-reliant, and she spent the first term assembling the rules of the new system before deciding whether to engage with it. By the second term she'd decided, and the decision was total. She was not the most brilliant girl at the school, which surprised her, and then did not. She was, however, the most patient, the one most willing to stay with a problem until she understood it fully, rather than moving on when she understood it adequately. This turned out to be, in the arithmetic class and the French class, and particularly in the natural history class taught by a retired naval surgeon named Mr. Peake, who had strong opinions about observational accuracy, the more useful quality. What the school gave her, beyond the curriculum, was an experience she could not easily name but would recognise in retrospect. The experience of being in a room where what mattered was what you knew and how clearly you could think, rather than who your father had been or what your prospects were. The girls at Chester came from similar circumstances, professional families in various stages of ruin, daughters of solicitors and doctors and engineers who had died or gone bankrupt or both. They were in the position of knowing exactly what they had lost and needing to develop, without delay and without the luxury of self-pity, the capabilities that would allow them to function without it. She also learned during those 6 years something the curriculum did not explicitly teach. What a room full of people who were all genuinely engaged with something felt like. There was a quality to those rooms. The arithmetic class on cold Monday mornings, the Friday afternoon literature discussions Miss Horton ran as though they mattered, which they did, that she would encounter in very few other places. She stored this feeling without knowing she was storing it. She would retrieve it many years later in a library at the end of a long stone corridor, with a fire burning and a book in her hands, and the sound of a house settling around her, like something beginning to be itself. She was, by every account, a genuinely good student. Not the kind of goodness that comes from compliance. She was not, in fact, particularly compliant, which caused occasional difficulties for the school's administration. She was good in the more inconvenient sense, genuinely curious, quick to notice the gap between what people said and what they actually meant, precise enough in her observations that her teachers were sometimes uncertain what to do with her questions, which had a habit of finding the thing that wasn't being said out loud. She learned French the way some children learn to swim, fast, and with an ease that looked like carelessness until you saw the accuracy underneath it. She read everything available, and a few things that weren't technically available, borrowed through arrangements she chose not to explain. She found Latin more interesting than the curriculum suggested she should. History, she thought, was considerably more complicated than the approved version. Mathematics was oddly satisfying in the way that anything with a provable answer can be satisfying when the rest of your life has none. She also learned at that school something that nobody taught directly. She learned how to exist in a room without disturbing it, how to watch without appearing to watch, how to hold an observation quietly, let it settle, and wait for the right moment to put it to use. This is not a skill most people develop deliberately. Eleanor developed it because she had to. In a charitable institution for the daughters of reduced families, invisibility was a form of protection. It turned out also to be a form of education, though she would not have described it that way at the time. She completed her training at 20 and took her first position in Surrey. The family had 4 children, a library that nobody used, and a mistress who referred to her as the Governess, in front of guests even when her name was perfectly well known to everyone in the room, not as a cruelty, simply as a matter of category. Eleanor noticed this on her 3rd day and said nothing. She filed it away instead. Her second position was in Bath, with a household that genuinely liked her. She was invited to tea twice, complimented on her French pronunciation, and still managed to be invisible in every room except the schoolroom. She stayed 14 months. When the family relocated to Edinburgh, they gave her good reference and 2 weeks' notice and wished her every success. She was 25. She packed her one good trunk, arranged temporary lodgings in London, and began looking for a 3rd position. That was the polite Victorian expression for it, between posts. It meant unemployed, with all her qualifications intact and none of her circumstances improved. She had modest savings, a small collection of letters of reference, and the particular disorienting liberty of someone who has lost the structure that ordinarily organises their days. The particular problem of a woman between posts in 1878 was not merely financial, though it was certainly that. It was also temporal and social and psychological simultaneously. Without a position, she had no legitimate claim on any particular place in the world. The lodging house was clean and quiet and run by a Mrs. Barker, who asked no questions, which suited Eleanor well. She paid by the week. She cooked nothing. She wrote letters to the agencies, kept her correspondence with referees current, read the advertisements in the Times that were relevant to her situation, with the focused attention she brought to useful documents. 3 inquiries pending at any given time. That was the correct number. Enough to provide options. Not so many that the responses overlapped into confusion. She also read. The circulating library 2 streets away was adequate, and she used it systematically, following one thread until it connected to another. She had been, in recent weeks, working through a somewhat random progression, that had begun with a novel and ended with several works about the Victorian debate over women's education. It was a debate that affected her directly, and she found it alternately interesting and maddening in the specific way of reading arguments about your own life written by people who have not lived it. The question of what to do with educated women who did not marry had become increasingly visible in public discourse by the 1870s. The Governess Benevolent Institution had been founded in 1843 to provide support for women in professional distress. The Society for Promoting the Employment of Women had been active since 1859. The Women's Colleges of Girton, founded in 1869, and Newnham, founded in 1871, were quietly and very effectively advancing the cause of women's higher education at Cambridge. The debates these developments produced tended to be circular in a way Eleanor found particularly revealing. Women could not be educated because their minds were not suited to it. Their minds were not suited to it because they had not been educated. Therefore, the current arrangement was both natural and inevitable. The argument held together only if you accepted all three premises simultaneously. Eleanor did not. What the debate generally failed to address was the specific situation of women like her. Not the women who could not be educated, but the ones who had been educated and remained in an economy with precisely one respectable outlet for that capability. It was not that there was no work for an intelligent woman. It was that there was almost no work she could perform without social penalty, within the constraints of respectability, that allowed her to remain the kind of person the world would recognize as one of its own. She thought about this sometimes. She did not find it useful to think about at length. The situation was what it was. She was working within the available constraints. She had also noticed, with the same precision she brought to everything, that those constraints had made her considerably more interesting to herself and to the few people who actually paid attention, because there is something that intelligence does when it is forced to work in limited space. It becomes precise. It becomes patient. It becomes, over time, rather formidable. She put down the book she was reading and went for a walk. She had decided to walk to Covent Garden that October morning for no particular reason, except that the weather was dry and she had nowhere she was required to be. She bought a small bunch of chrysanthemums from the flower girl at the market's edge, paid twopence for them, and began making her way back through the crowd. The market was, as it always was on a dry morning in October, a particular kind of overwhelm. Not unpleasant. She decided early on that overwhelming was not unpleasant if you were the kind of person who found the density of the world interesting, which she was. Covent Garden at this hour was running on at least 4 kinds of effort simultaneously. The wholesale operation that had begun before dawn, the retail trade that had begun at 5, the secondary market of street sellers who bought from the stalls to sell on the pavements, and the general commerce of appetite and weather and human will that made a market alive in the way that nothing else quite is. The smells were honest. Earth and fish and old wood and something fermenting, and the clean, sharp cold of the air above it all, the smell of a city in autumn that has remembered what it is underneath the summer version of itself. She had walked through market crowds all her adult life in one city or another, and had developed the particular navigational manner of someone who moves through dense spaces by reading the current of other people's movement rather than fighting it. She kept her shoulders narrow and her pace steady, and her eyes slightly ahead of where she was going, and the crowd parted around her in a way it did not part around people who pushed. She had the chrysanthemums in her left hand slightly raised to protect them. A market in full mourning was, she had found, one of the few places in London where a woman alone attracted no attention whatever, because everyone was either selling something or buying something, or trying to get somewhere, and a woman with flowers and a steady walk was simply part of the picture. In those 14 months in Bath, and the 12 months before that in Surrey, the one room that had ever been entirely hers was the schoolroom. Every other space in the house belonged to someone else, in a way that was clear and non-negotiable. The drawing room was the family's, the dining room was the family's, the library, if there was one, was the family's, though nobody in either household used theirs with any regularity. The servants' hall belonged to the cook and the footman and the housemaids, who had their own complicated hierarchy and their own rules about who sat where. The schoolroom belonged to Eleanor and the children she taught, and within that room she was in every functional sense in charge. She'd noticed what that did to her. The sense of authority that comes not from rank or money, but from being the only person in a space who actually knows what they're doing. She was very good at teaching. She had not expected to be. She had taken the work out of necessity, not vocation. But it turned out that the same quality of attention that made her useful as an observer made her unusually effective as a teacher. She could tell, in the first few minutes of a lesson, exactly where a child's understanding had a gap in it. She could find the explanation that fit the particular shape of their confusion. She could be patient without being condescending, which is rarer than it sounds. The schoolroom was where she was not invisible. That was worth something. What the years had given her, beyond the French and the references and the careful habit of watching, was a kind of clarity that only comes from having very little to lose. When you have no position to protect, no inheritance to guard, no reputation among the people who matter, no social standing that a single wrong word could topple, you can afford to see things as they actually are. Eleanor had spent 4 years in households where everyone around her was performing something. The gracious employer, the distinguished gentleman, the well-bred daughter. She had watched all of it from a position so far outside the performance that she could see the scaffolding holding it up. She did not resent this. She had stopped resenting it sometime in the 2nd year. What she had instead was an accurate map of how things worked and the freedom that comes from having nothing to perform in return. She was almost at the far end of the market when she heard the shouting. It took her a moment to locate the source. The market was always loud. That was its nature. That was what it was for. But there was a particular quality to this sound that was different from the general roar. A single voice, raised and sustained, with the edge of genuine grievance rather than mere commerce in it. She turned toward it without particularly deciding to. A fruit vendor, red-faced and certain of himself, stood at his stall at the junction of 2 canvas-covered aisles. He was speaking to a woman, or rather he was speaking at a woman, loudly, and with the confidence of someone who had already decided the argument was settled. The woman was elderly, plainly dressed in a grey wool cloak that had seen better seasons, and she was standing very still. Not in the stillness of someone frightened, in the stillness of someone considering their options. The woman had apparently handled a piece of fruit, a fine late pear, and then set it back down. The vendor had decided this constituted a commitment. He wanted payment for a pear she hadn't bought. The woman had declined. The vendor had escalated. The crowd had arranged itself into a circle of spectators who were watching with considerable interest and intervening not at all. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the gathering. She assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. The vendor was wrong. His argument had no merit. The woman had handled the pear, not purchased it. There was no market custom, no reasonable interpretation of events under which the woman owed this man anything. The woman knew this. The vendor knew it too, but had made the calculation that social pressure and volume would prevail over logic. The crowd had made the calculation that it was someone else's problem. Eleanor had nothing comfortable to protect. She stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She had learned, across 4 years of managing schoolrooms, that the most effective response to escalation is almost always deliberate quiet. She said, with the precise calm of someone identifying a clerical error, that it was customary for payment to follow purchase rather than precede it, and that no purchase appeared to have occurred. She said this pleasantly. She said it in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. The vendor turned toward her. He made a rapid assessment. Young woman, plain coat, no companion of visible consequence, and decided she was manageable. He attempted to manage her. This was a miscalculation. She had 4 years of practice in being underestimated. She knew exactly what to do with it. She observed, still pleasantly, that market disputes of this nature occasionally caught the attention of the constables who patrolled this section on weekday mornings. She noted that the vendor's regular customers, several of whom were watching from adjacent stalls, might find a complaint about his practices worth mentioning to their neighbours. She did not threaten him. She simply made it clear, in very few words, that she had thought through the situation more carefully than he had. He refunded his demand, not graciously, but he refunded it. She turned to go. The elderly woman was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not gratitude exactly. Something more considered. The expression of someone who has just seen something they had hoped to find and hadn't entirely expected to. The woman was Margaret Constance Wyndham, Dowager Duchess of Wyndham. Eleanor did not know this. The grey wool cloak had been selected for exactly that purpose. The Dowager had maintained a habit for nearly 30 years. Through the complaints of 2 social secretaries and the bewilderment of 3 different ladies' maids, of walking the London markets in plain dress once or twice a season. She found it useful in ways that were difficult to explain to people who had never had cause to wonder whether the world they saw was the world that existed. The world that presented itself to a woman of her rank was, she had observed very early in her married life, a carefully edited version of reality, edited for her comfort, her approval, her continued confidence in the order of things. The market, unedited, was clarifying. The grey cloak worked not because it was a disguise, but because it was the absence of signal. No one was looking for a duchess in grey wool, so no one saw one. She had been in the market for an hour before the incident. She had been observing and thinking as was her habit. The problem that had occupied her thoughts for the past several weeks was still occupying them, and it had not grown any simpler with attention. Her son did not know she was thinking about it. She was reasonably certain he was trying not to think about it himself, and was succeeding poorly. She stopped Eleanor before she could walk away. She said simply, "Will you walk with me a moment?" Eleanor looked back. Something in the question was unusual, not in its words, but in its manner. It was not a command, and not quite a request. It was delivered with the ease of someone who had never had genuine cause to wonder whether they would be refused. Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not collecting for a cause," the woman added, with a very dry edge to it. "I'd simply like to continue walking, and I'd prefer company to the alternative." Eleanor walked with her. They went the length of the central lane. The Dowager asked 3 questions. what Eleanor was doing in the market that morning, the answer was brief and honest. Where she worked, the answer was honest and considerably more complicated. What she had made of the pear incident, specifically her reasoning with the vendor, Eleanor answered this one honestly too, which meant explaining that she had made a rapid assessment of the vendor's dependency on his regular clientele and had applied pressure in that direction. The woman listened to this without interrupting. She nodded at the end of it. Once, with the small, efficient nod of someone filing away information they planned to use, at the far end of the lane she stopped. She produced a card, plain cream-coloured stock, an address Eleanor knew only by reputation, and held it out. She said she would like Eleanor to call on her the following week. Eleanor took the card. She read it. Her expression, which she had considerable practice in keeping quite still, may have shifted very slightly. "As a guest," the woman said, "not as a prospective employee. I want to be clear on that point." Eleanor looked at her. "Why?" The Dowager considered this for a moment. "Because I think you might be useful, and because I have not met many people recently who said the correct thing when they could have said nothing. I find I've been missing that quality." She thanked Eleanor, briefly without ceremony, and walked away. The grey cloak dissolved into the crowd. Eleanor stood at the far end of the lane holding a card and a bunch of chrysanthemums and thinking, with the careful precision she brought to most things, about whether or not to go. She took the card back to her lodgings. She set it on the mantelpiece and looked at it for 3 days. She thought about the various reasons not to go. There were several, and they were not unreasonable. She had no idea what the invitation actually meant beyond what was printed on the card. She had no business inserting herself into the affairs of a household about which she knew nothing. She was between positions, which meant her time was better spent corresponding with prospective employers than making social calls on strangers, however grandly housed. She was a governess, formerly, currently, and in all likelihood permanently, and the Dowager Duchess of Wyndham, whoever she was, moved in a world as far from Eleanor's actual circumstances as one could get without leaving the country. She thought about all of this carefully and at some length. What she did during those 3 days was think in the systematic and patient way she'd developed for problems that did not resolve immediately. She looked at the card from several directions. It was a heavy card, well printed, with the Wyndham crest in the upper left corner, a household that understood the weight of a first impression. She had no prior knowledge of this woman. She had no information about the household beyond what one could infer from a card and a brief conversation. What she knew directly: the Dowager was sharp, observant, and apparently in the habit of saying what she meant without the social padding that usually surrounded meaning in Eleanor's experience. She'd moved through Covent Garden on foot and alone, which suggested a level of comfort with the world that most women of her presumed rank did not exhibit. She'd observed Eleanor manage a market incident and had drawn a conclusion about Eleanor's character from that observation, which meant she was the kind of person who drew conclusions from evidence rather than from social category. She'd then offered an invitation that was direct to the point of being almost startling. "I have not met many people recently who said the correct thing when they could have said nothing." Eleanor turned this sentence over. It was an odd thing for a Dowager Duchess to say to a governess she had met 20 minutes ago in a market. It was also, she had to admit, an accurate description of what had happened. She had said the correct thing. She had not calculated whether it was the correct thing. She had simply seen a situation that required a response and provided one. That this was visible to someone who'd been watching from a distance was interesting. That it was valued rather than noted and set aside was more interesting still. Whether the invitation was a good idea in practical terms was a separate question from whether she wanted to go. She found, on the third afternoon, that the second question was not actually in question at all. On the fourth morning she packed a small bag. She wrote to the address on the card to confirm she was coming. She received a reply within the day, a note in a handwriting that was precise, rather beautiful, and completely unhurried, confirming that a carriage would be sent for her on Friday morning. Not a suggestion. A carriage would be sent. Eleanor read this, and thought that the Dowager had apparently decided the matter some time before Eleanor had. She spent Thursday evening checking that her better dress was pressed, and her boots were clean, and her letters of reference were in order, and then she caught herself doing this and stopped, because she was not going as a prospective employee, and she'd been told as much, and she was not entirely sure what she was going as instead. The carriage arrived on Friday morning exactly when it was said to arrive. Eleanor got into it. The driver said nothing. The city gave way to road and then to countryside, and the countryside, in the way of the English countryside in October, gave way to the long amber flatness of fields and the particular grey-blue of an autumn sky that has made its decision about the year and is not going back on it. She watched the fields go past and thought about what she was doing, and somewhere around the second hour she gave up thinking about it and simply looked at the light instead. The light was worth looking at. October in England has a specific quality of afternoon light that is unlike any other month. Lower than summer, still golden but with a lean to it, as though the sun has decided to take the world more seriously now that summer is done with. The fields had mostly been turned. A few had winter wheat showing, the precise even green of something that has just decided to begin. The trees at the field edges were at every point of the change simultaneously, some still holding their leaves fully, some bare, some in the amber and crimson that is the brief, intense moment just before the whole arrangement lets go. The sky above it was very high and pale and entirely unhurried. She'd spent 4 years in urban and semi-urban households. The Bath house with its terrace and walled garden, the Surrey house with its immaculate grounds that were designed to be looked at rather than walked in. She had not spent much time in actual countryside, the kind where the fields went to the horizon without a building in the way, and the quiet was real rather than managed. She found it, to her own mild surprise, extremely agreeable. There was a quality to the space out here that the city didn't have, and that she hadn't known she missed, because she'd had no occasion to miss it. The capacity to look at something until it ended, rather than until the next thing got in the way. She was still looking when the road curved, and the beach-lined avenue appeared, and then at the end of it, very pale and very still against the October sky, the stone of Wyndham Hall. She noticed that her reaction to seeing it for the first time was not what she would have predicted. It was not awe exactly, it was more like recognition, the feeling of encountering a thing that is already in some way known, even when it is objectively new. She filed this too, with the careful attention she brought to all things that seemed to carry future significance. The gates of Wyndham Hall appeared around a long curve in the road. They were iron, very tall, and absolutely still. The house was not yet visible, set back behind a line of beeches that had turned, and the afternoon light came through the branches in long, slow bars. She had spent 4 years making herself invisible in other people's houses. Whatever was waiting for her behind those gates, she was fairly certain it would ask something different of her. She did not know yet what that something was, but she was about to find out. Wyndham Hall was not the largest estate in that part of the country, but it was among the oldest, and age in an English country house has a way of making itself felt before you have fully arrived. The drive was long and curved and lined with beeches on both sides, the trees planted close enough together that the light between them became rhythmic, amber, shadow, in a way that slowed something in the chest without you quite deciding to let it. The house appeared at the end of it, 3 stories of pale stone, Georgian in its proportions, older in its bones, with chimneys sending up thin threads of smoke against the October sky. The carriage stopped at the main entrance. A footman opened the door before Eleanor had finished gathering herself. He said nothing, offered a hand she didn't need, and stood back with the absolute blank politeness of a household that had been doing this for generations. She got down and stood for a moment in the gravel and looked at the house. The house, for its part, did not particularly notice her. She was shown inside by a housekeeper named Mrs. Fitch, who was precise, efficient, and not unfriendly, in the way of senior household staff who have had to calibrate their warmth carefully around guests of uncertain category. Eleanor was not a servant, she was not a family member, she was not a titled guest. Mrs. Fitch had clearly received instructions, and she followed them with the particular crispness of someone whose following instructions they find interesting. Eleanor was given a room in the east wing, not the servants' quarters and not the principal guest rooms, which were to the west and rather grander in the same way that everything in the west wing was rather grander. The east wing had windows that faced the kitchen garden, and a view, across a low stone wall, of the home farm. It was a warm room, well appointed, with a fire already burning and a jug of hot water on the washstand. It was the room you gave to a guest who needed to be treated well without being assigned a status. She noted all of this and said nothing about any of it. The house was larger than it presented itself from the front. This was characteristic of estates of its age. Each generation had added something, a wing or a conservatory, or a set of additional rooms whose original purpose was now unclear, so that the whole had accumulated a kind of architectural autobiography over 2 centuries. A door at the far end of the east wing corridor led to a back staircase that brought you out in a passage behind the kitchen quarters. The kitchen quarters were another country entirely, warm with the particular warmth of places where several fires burn all day, smelling of beeswax and yeast, and the serious steady smell of a kitchen that feeds 30 people 3 times a day, regardless of what else is happening. She would explore more of this later. She noted now that the servants moved through those spaces with an efficiency that meant the house had been well run for a long time, not recently tidied for a visitor. The social geography of the house revealed itself in its own way, in the quality of different rooms. The drawing-room, glimpsed through a partially opened door as Mrs. Fitch showed her the corridor, had the particular cleanness of a space kept ready for an occasion that arrives infrequently. The breakfast-room, which she passed at the far end of the ground floor, had the worn, comfortable look of the room where the actual household happened. There was a difference, she had learned, between the rooms a house displayed and the rooms a house lived in. The rooms that were lived in were almost always more interesting. She filed this observation alongside everything else and said nothing about it to anyone. She had 40 minutes before dinner was served, and she used them to wash, change into her better dress. Dark grey wool, well cut, chosen with the same care she brought to everything she couldn't afford to get wrong, and think about what she was doing. She had still not arrived at a satisfying answer to that question. She had arrived at the estate of a woman she had met 4 days ago in a market at that woman's invitation, with no clear purpose stated. She was a governess between posts. She had no social standing that the inhabitants of this house were obliged to acknowledge. She had a handful of letters of reference, a good dress, and the ability to say correct things without flinching. She'd managed on less. Dinner was at 7. Eleanor was shown to the dining room by a second footman who had apparently been given specific instructions about where she was to be seated, which turned out to be to the Dowager's right, which was not where she'd expected to find herself. The table was long enough for 12 and set for 3. The Dowager was already seated when Eleanor arrived. The third place was empty. She asked Eleanor, once she had settled, whether the journey had been comfortable. Eleanor said it had. She asked whether the room was satisfactory. Eleanor said it was very much so. There was a pause while the first course was brought in. Then Margaret said without particular preamble, "My son will join us shortly. He doesn't know you're here." Eleanor considered this information. She decided for the moment to treat it as a neutral statement of fact. "Is that usual?" she asked. "No," the Dowager said, "but then you're not a usual kind of guest." There was a sound in the corridor. The door opened. The Duke of Wyndham was 33 years old, tall in a way that looked less like advantage than obligation, and he had the particular expression of a man who has arrived at a situation he did not entirely plan for and is deciding in real time how to regard it. He saw Eleanor. His eyes moved to his mother. His mother met his gaze with a pleasantness so complete, it was, Eleanor thought, almost a work of art. He sat down. He was introduced to Eleanor as Miss Ashworth, lately of London. She was introduced to him simply as James. She noted this, the absence of the title, the careful levelling of the introduction, and filed it away as deliberate. The dinner proceeded. Eleanor spoke when spoken to and occasionally when not spoken to, because she had gauged within the first 10 minutes that this household did not require silence from its guests and would not have been comfortable with it. The Dowager asked her about her views on a particular French poet. Eleanor had views, which surprised the Duke enough that he set down his glass. She asked the Duke a question about the estate's management of its tenant farms, because this was visible from her bedroom window, and she was genuinely curious, and because the quality of his answer would tell her something useful about him. His answer was more specific and more thoughtful than she had expected. She noted this too. He was, she thought, performing something. Not dishonestly. The performance was not designed to deceive. It was the performance of a man who had learned to present a version of himself that could be managed by the world around him, because the unedited version was more complicated than most situations required. She recognized this immediately. She had been doing something similar for 4 years in the opposite direction. The Dowager watched them both with an attention so thoroughly concealed it looked like pleasant conversation. Eleanor noticed it. She was fairly certain the Duke had not. She had been, she thought, demonstrated, not interrogated. The dinner had felt nothing like an interrogation, but the structure of it was clear in retrospect. The Dowager asking Eleanor questions that allowed Eleanor to answer in her own voice. The questions themselves chosen with a precision that was only visible once the dinner was over. The Duke present and listening. Eleanor being shown to best advantage by the simple method of being given space to speak naturally, in a room where speaking naturally was the correct thing to do. What she had made of the Duke in those first 2 hours was provisional, but not insignificant. He had answered her question about the timber rights in a way that told her more than he had intended, specifically in a way that suggested he thought carefully about his land and found the thinking genuinely worthwhile rather than obligatory. He was precise and correct. He was not performing expertise. He simply had it. She had found this unexpectedly interesting, in the way of a detail that doesn't fit the category you have provisionally assigned to a person, and therefore requires adjustment. She also noted that he had, at a specific point in the conversation, looked at something she said and almost smiled. He had caught it, but the almost had been visible. After dinner, the Dowager retired early and mentioned in passing that Eleanor was welcome to explore the ground floor if she found sleep elusive. The Duke excused himself to his study without looking at Eleanor again, which he took as the result of some private decision rather than indifference. She walked back through the entrance hall alone. The house had settled into a different atmosphere with the daylight gone. The entrance hall was lit by a single lamp at the far end, and the shadows of the ceiling's carved plasterwork moved very slightly in the draught from the front door. The portraits on the east wall, 3 generations of Wyndhams by the look of them, each successively taller and equally serious, watched the empty room with the mild indifference of people who have been watching rooms for a long time. She turned right toward the corridor that led to the east wing and then stopped. The door at the far end of the corridor was ajar. Just ajar, the width of a hand, no more. The light that came through it was the warm, particular amber of candle and firelight combined. She could smell very faintly old leather and wood smoke and the specific close warmth of a room full of books that has been loved for a long time. She looked at it for a moment. She did not go in. She was a guest, not a member of the household, and a room with a closed, or nearly closed, door was not an invitation. But she noted it. She filed it away in that careful internal register she kept of things that mattered without yet knowing why. She walked back to the east wing and slept, unexpectedly well, in the room that overlooked the kitchen garden. The Dowager Duchess of Wyndham had not always been the Dowager Duchess of Wyndham. This seems self-evident but is worth saying, because the woman who had occupied that position for the past 7 years was so thoroughly herself in it that it was difficult, even for people who had known her for decades, to remember that she had been other things first. She had been born Margaret Cecily Holt in Hertfordshire in 1825, the second daughter of a well-respected but not spectacularly wealthy family. She had been raised with considerable attention paid to accomplishments, and rather less to her opinions on the matter. She was accomplished. She was also, from an early age, quietly and precisely intelligent, in a way that her mother had occasionally found inconvenient, and her father had found rather admirable. She had married the late Duke of Wyndham at 22, in the way of women of her class and era. Not entirely without her consent, but not primarily at her direction either. He had been a good man in most of the important ways. He had been kind. He had not been cruel. He had not been particularly perceptive about her interior life, but she had not been particularly transparent about it, and this had eventually become an equilibrium that suited them both well enough. What 30 years of that marriage had taught her was the precise geography of the power available to a woman in her position. It existed, she discovered, in very specific locations and required very specific instruments. The household accounts, which she had managed herself not because anyone asked, but because competence was more useful than deference. The servants, who understood that she knew everyone's name and situation and ability. The social engagements, which she managed with an efficiency that people mistook for graciousness, and which was in fact a form of strategy. The correspondence, always written herself. Her husband had left her the dower right, which was the legal instrument. But the actual power she exercised was older than any legal instrument. It had to do with knowing, with patience and precision, what a situation actually required. Not what it appeared to require, not what the social form suggested, but what the human dynamics underneath it needed in order for things to go as well as they could. She had been doing this for 30 years. She had become, in that time, very good at it. She had spotted Eleanor Ashworth from 30 feet away across a market, not because she had been looking for her, but because the quality Eleanor possessed of watching everything with the full, quiet attention of someone who understood that watching carefully was the most useful thing available, was the quality she herself had spent 30 years cultivating, and it was unusual enough in another person to be immediately recognizable. She had done what she always did when she encountered something useful. She'd kept it close, she had thought about it carefully, and she had waited for the right moment to put it to work. What she didn't know, as she slept, was that the house she was sleeping in existed in a state of considerable legal and financial complexity that is currently known to 3 people, one of whom was in the study at the end of the west wing, not sleeping at all. An English aristocratic estate in 1878 was not simply a house and its grounds. It was a legal entity, a financial structure, a piece of social architecture that had been shaped by generations of inheritance law and marriage settlement and strategic debt and careful preservation. The Duke of Wyndham did not simply own Wyndham Hall in the way that a man owns a coat or a horse. What he held was a life interest, which is to say the right to live in it, benefit from it, and manage it, but not to sell it, mortgage it, or dispose of it in any way that might diminish what the next generation would inherit. This was called a strict settlement, and it was the standard instrument of the English aristocratic estate for most of the 19th century. The Settled Land Acts of 1882 to 1890 would eventually loosen these restrictions, but in 1878 they had not yet been passed. In 1878, the Duke of Wyndham was, in the most precise legal sense, a tenant for life on his own ancestral estate. He could not raise money against it. He could not sell any portion of it. He could not mortgage so much as one of its fields. His father had left debts. The debts were not the result of extravagance, or not primarily. The late Duke had made several investments in the 1860s that had seemed, at the time, quite reasonable. Industrial ventures, railway extensions, the kinds of things that a man of his generation and class had been consistently told were the future of England. Some of them had been. Some had been the future of other people's fortunes. The exact sum owed was not spoken of directly in the household. It was one of those numbers that everyone knew in approximation, and nobody confirmed in specifics, the way one might know that a structural problem exists in a building without wanting to look at the foundations too closely. What was clear was this: the debt was real. The estate could not legally be used to resolve it, and someone outside the family knew the exact figures and held the documents that proved them. That person's name was Sir Henry Cale, Baronet, and the Duke of Wyndham was thinking about him in the study at the end of the west wing as the house went quiet around him and the candles burned down. James Wyndham had inherited his title at 23, which was young enough to feel the weight of it before he had developed the particular callous that long-held authority tends to produce. He had known, from the age of 17, that the title was coming to him. His father had been ill for some years before the end, and the succession had been a matter of when rather than whether. He had spent those years trying to understand what he was inheriting, which turned out to be considerably more complicated than an estate and a name. He was, in his private self, the self that existed in the study at 11:30, when the house had gone quiet and there was nobody he was required to be, a thoughtful man. He read extensively in the somewhat unfashionable direction of legal history and philosophy, and he managed the estate's tenant farms with a precision that surprised people who expected the titled class to leave such things to agents. He was good at the details of land. He was less good at the performance of his rank, which he found tiring in the way that any sustained performance tires a person who would rather be doing something else. What he read, in those late hours in the study, was not what most people who knew him as a duke expected a duke to read. He kept Beige-Hot in a visible location on the shelves. The phrase, "as Beige-Hot says," was useful for closing certain kinds of argument at certain kinds of dinner, and he kept a complete set of Victorian agricultural surveys, which he added to and which nobody else in the household touched. What he actually read, in the hours that were his own, was the philosophy of utility. Mill, Bentham in measured doses, and a French economist named Bastiat, whose work he had found in translation and which he read with the specific pleasure of someone who has encountered a mind that seems to work the way his own does, even at the considerable remove of language and geography. He was privately interested in the question of how institutions became what they were, how legal structures accumulated over time into shapes that nobody had designed, and that frequently worked against the purposes they were meant to serve. The strict settlement was the most immediate and least abstract example in his own life, an instrument designed to protect aristocratic estates against reckless inheritance that had, in his specific case, produced precisely the condition it was meant to prevent. He could not sell the estate because the settlement existed to protect him from selling the estate, and the problem was not a temptation to sell, but a debt accumulated by his father before the question of selling arose, and the settlement had not anticipated this particular configuration. He thought about this with the dry, precise interest of someone who finds structural irony genuinely engaging at the level of principle, even when it is very inconvenient at the level of the personal. It was not a useful thing to think about. It did not suggest a solution, but it kept the problem at the proper analytical distance, which was sometimes the most he could manage. Eleanor had noticed the books on his study shelves in the brief moment she passed the open door on her first evening. She'd noted Mill and Bastiat alongside the agricultural surveys. She'd not commented on this. She had revised, quietly and permanently, the picture she was assembling of the man who had sat across from her at dinner with the expression of someone deciding in real time what to make of an unexpected situation. He was also, by the time Eleanor Ashworth arrived in his dining room without warning on a Friday evening in October 1878, carrying a problem that had no good solution. What the problem looked like from the inside day to day was a kind of bureaucracy of dread. He woke before 6 and went through the papers on his desk, the estate correspondence, the tenant inquiries, the seasonal accounts, with the precision he brought to all practical matters, because the practical matters were the only things he could actually affect. The drainage issue on the North Farm, the fence repair on the eastern boundary, the roof of the empty cottage near the home farm lane that had been discussed in 3 consecutive letters and would apparently be discussed in 3 more before anyone actually went and looked at it. These things he managed effectively, with the focused attention of a man who prefers to deal with the thing directly in front of him when the alternative is dealing with the thing he cannot bring himself to look at directly. The partition he maintained between the practical and the impossible was, he knew, not entirely sustainable. It leaked at the edges. On the mornings when a letter arrived from his solicitor containing careful language about timelines and formal obligations, the partition became somewhat thinner. On the mornings after Cale's visits, it became very thin indeed. He had, on one occasion, sat down to draft a response to Cale's most recent communication and written 3/4 of a letter that came, upon rereading, uncomfortably close to saying yes. He had put it in the fire, which was not a decision he had consciously made so much as a decision his hand had made on his behalf, which he had chosen to respect. The house had 43 household staff and 12 people in the home farm operation. Mrs. Fitch had been at Wyndham Hall for 22 years. The head groom's 3 children attended the village school. These things were not abstractions. They were reasons, specific and fully personalised, that the estate's financial stability needed to be maintained. They were also, on certain mornings, the reason he could not quite let himself accept the terms that would resolve everything. The strict settlement that bound Wyndham Hall had been drawn up at his father's marriage, updated at his grandfather's marriage before that, and was, in the judgment of the estate's solicitors, entirely watertight. It meant that every field, every farm building, every piece of woodland and every tenant cottage on the property was legally beyond his power to liquidate. The estate produced income, enough income in ordinary circumstances to maintain the house and its staff and the general requirements of a duke's existence. But it was not enough to service a debt of the size his father had accumulated, and also continue doing those other things at the same time. He had considered every arrangement available to him. He had looked at the income from the tenant farms and the home farm, and the timber rights and the mineral extraction that supplemented them, and he had done the mathematics several times over several years, and the mathematics, as mathematics tends to, had given him the same answer each time. He needed to marry money. This was not an unusual solution. Throughout the 1870s there was a well-established market for exactly this transaction. Aristocratic title and land offered in exchange for industrial or commercial wealth, usually from families who had made their fortunes in manufacturing or trade, and wanted the respectability that a good marriage could provide. American heiresses had begun arriving in significant numbers, drawn by the specific romance of the English peerage. There were arrangements to be made, families willing to make them. The difficulty was Sir Henry Cale. Sir Henry Cale was the kind of man who became powerful through the patient accumulation of other people's vulnerabilities. He was not a financier, precisely, and not quite a money-lender, and not quite anything that had a respectable name. He was a man who moved through the edges of aristocratic society, always invited, never quite at the centre of anything, and who had, over the course of 20 years, acquired a collection of financial documents and personal obligations that gave him, in various degrees, some leverage over approximately a dozen different families of the English upper class. He had acquired the late Duke's debt papers from the primary creditor, who had sold them at a discount rather than spend years attempting to recover money from an entailed estate. Cale had bought them because he understood, with the patience of a man who planned several moves ahead, exactly what they could be worth to him. What he wanted from James Wyndham was simple. He wanted the Duke to marry his daughter, a young woman named Charlotte Cale, who was perfectly pleasant and entirely without the freedom to have declined the plan if she'd wanted to, and in exchange for this marriage, Cale would consider the debt documents satisfied. He would not call in the debts. He would not expose the details of the family's financial position to the very public inquiry that would result if he chose to. He would, in short, behave decently, in exchange for a title by marriage and an aristocratic address for his grandchildren. The Duke had been sitting with this offer for 6 weeks. He had not accepted it. He had also not found a way to refuse it. Both of these facts were keeping him awake. There was one more piece to this particular arrangement that Cale had the grace not to state directly, though he'd made it quite clear. If the Duke were to marry someone else, anyone else, regardless of her wealth or connections, The debt documents would become suddenly inconveniently public. The Duke's financial position would be exposed. His ability to make any other advantageous marriage would collapse. The estate's reputation would suffer in ways that were difficult to predict and impossible to reverse. The trap was elegant in the way that traps designed by patient people often are. It had very few moving parts. It required only that the Duke remain in the position he was already in, unable to act, unable to sell, unable to raise money against his own land, and it would eventually close around him by its own logic. What Cale had not calculated, because he was very good at financial pressure and less good at the particular complications of human character, was that the Duke's mother was still alive, in excellent health, and considerably more dangerous than she looked. The Dowager Duchess of Wyndham held what English law called a dower right, 1/3 of all income from her late husband's real property, guaranteed to her for the remainder of her life, and protected by the same settlement that prevented her son from selling anything. This meant, among other things, that her annual income was substantial, legally secure and entirely beyond Cale's reach. He could not threaten it, encumber it, or use it as leverage. It was hers, as completely as anything in Victorian England could belong to a woman, and she had her own solicitor, her own bank account, and her own clear understanding of what she possessed. She had not as yet told her son the full extent of what she was thinking. She had told him only that she believed the situation was manageable, which he'd received with the polite disbelief of a man who could see the mathematics and found them unpersuasive. He did not know about Eleanor Ashworth yet, not entirely. Eleanor, for her part, spent her second morning at Wyndham Hall in the way she spent most mornings, making careful observations. She walked through the ground floor rooms with the Dowager after breakfast, because the Dowager had suggested it, and she catalogued the house as she moved through it, the way she had learned to catalogue the houses she worked in. The breakfast room, the morning room south-facing, with windows that caught the light from the garden. The drawing room, which was large and formal and clearly used rarely. The corridor that led west toward the study. The Duke joined them for a late breakfast on the second morning and said very little, but he was listening, which Eleanor could tell because he had the quality of stillness that attentive people have, different from the stillness of someone who has simply stopped paying attention, which tends toward the slack. He was engaged. He was simply processing it quietly. She asked him, directly, about the timber rights she had noticed mentioned in a document that had been left open on the hall table. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating. Most people, he said later that evening, did not notice estate documents on hall tables. Most people, Eleanor said, were not between positions and paying careful attention to everything. He laughed at this. It was a brief laugh, surprised rather than performed, and it changed his face in a way that was considerably more revealing than he probably intended. Underneath the Duke, there was a man who had not laughed at an unrehearsed thing in some time. The fact that she had produced one appeared to disconcert him. She found this interesting. She also found it significant that, when she left the room that evening, she caught him looking at the door after she had gone through it. Not in any romantic sense. It was too early in the story for that, and she would have been the first to say so. But there is a way that people look at doors when the person who has just left them is still in their thoughts, and she'd been trained by 4 years of invisibility to notice exactly that kind of thing. The Dowager, she suspected, had noticed it too. There was one moment on the third evening that told her something the rest of the visit had only been suggesting. She had come downstairs late because she couldn't sleep, and she passed the study door. It was open a crack. The Duke was inside at the large desk by the window, and he was not working. He was sitting quite still, both hands flat on the closed surface of a ledger he hadn't opened, and he was looking at nothing in particular. He looked very precisely like a man who has accepted a situation he does not want to accept, and is working out in the quiet dark of the night how to carry it. She did not stop. She walked on, and he didn't hear her. But she stood in her room afterward for a long time, thinking about what she had seen. There was a word for what was sitting on the surface of that ledger. She didn't know it yet, but she was beginning to understand its shape. Sir Henry Cale arrived at Wyndham Hall on the fourth morning unannounced. This was not quite accurate. He had sent a note the previous afternoon which made his arrival technically announced, but the note had said only that he intended to call, not that he required the Duke's presence, not that he had a particular business in mind, and certainly not that this was the third such visit in 6 weeks. He arrived as though dropping by on a social impulse, in a carriage that was slightly more elaborate than good taste required, wearing a coat that was slightly better cut than the occasion demanded. He was 61 years old, prosperous in his appearance, and he had the kind of surface ease that is produced not by genuine confidence, but by decades of practice in its performance. He had a title. He was called Sir Henry. He was referred to in formal correspondence as Baronet. These things gave him, in the language of Victorian social life, a particular kind of standing. Not aristocratic exactly, but elevated, respectable, the kind of rank that got a man into rooms that ordinary wealth alone might not open. The difficulty with this picture, if you held it up to the light, was that a baronet was not an aristocrat. He was not even close to one, in the technical sense. A baronet was a hereditary title, certainly, and it carried the honorific Sir, and it was older than many peerages. But it was not a peerage. A baronet sat in no House of Lords. He held no seat of political power by right of his title. He was, by the strict standards of English constitutional law, a commoner, elevated, titled, addressed with deference, but a commoner none the less. The title itself had been created in 1611 by King James I, and the mechanism of its creation said something useful about its nature. It was invented as a revenue device. The crown needed money, as crowns frequently do, and the solution arrived at was to sell a new category of hereditary honour. The original price was £1,095. The buyers were men who wanted respectability badly enough to pay for it, and who were wealthy enough to do so. Over time, the title accumulated the weight of tradition, and the legitimacy that tradition tends to produce. By the Victorian era, a baronetcy was considered a perfectly genuine form of distinction. But its foundation, if you were inclined to look at foundations, was commercial. Sir Henry Cale's title had been in his family for 2 generations, which gave it the patina of inheritance. His grandfather had bought it, which was not mentioned in polite conversation, and was perfectly well known to everyone who knew the family. His social power, and he had genuine social power of a very specific kind, rested entirely on reputation, on the impression he made, on the network of careful relationships he had cultivated across 30 years of methodical effort. He had no hereditary seat in Parliament. He had no land that carried political weight. He had a title, a manor, a great deal of money, and a collection of documents that gave him leverage over people who had more name than sense. He was, in short, exactly as powerful as the people around him believed him to be. He had done this before, not with the Wyndhams. The Wyndham situation was his most significant current operation, but with at least 2 other families in the previous decade, both of them with names that appeared in Burke's peerage and incomes that had been under quiet strain for longer than anyone acknowledged in public. The first case had involved a debt whose origin was rather more embarrassing than railway investment, a gambling debt carried by the previous generation and inherited along with everything else. The second had involved a more recent and more complex financial arrangement that had gone wrong in ways the family's solicitors had not fully understood until it was too late. In both cases, Cale had proceeded with the same patient care. He had acquired the relevant documentation through legitimate means, buying distressed debt, purchasing the rights to instruments that creditors wanted to move off their books, and had then presented himself to the relevant parties as a reasonable man interested in a reasonable resolution. He did not threaten. He suggested. He offered terms that were uncomfortable but survivable, and he made it quietly clear that the alternative was considerably less comfortable. Both families had complied. Both remained intact, functional, socially presentable. Both remained, in a way that required no formal acknowledgement, within the network of obligation and goodwill that Cale was methodically building across the English upper class. He was, in his own estimation, providing a service, clarity, resolution, an exit from an impossible situation at a cost that was real but bearable. He had never ruined a family. He was very careful about this. A ruined family was no good to him. It could pay nothing, owe nothing useful, provide no future value. He needed his subjects to remain standing. He was simply adjusting the terms on which they stood. This is not nothing. Belief in the Victorian social world had structural consequences. A man believed to be powerful was treated as powerful, which created the conditions for actual power, which reinforced the belief. The loop was self-sustaining as long as nobody named it aloud. Cale was very careful to make sure nobody named it aloud. His particular approach to the Duke had the elegance of simplicity. He held debt documents, legal instruments, properly acquired, describing sums owed by the Wyndham estate that were real, provable and substantial. The documents themselves were not the weapon. The threat of making them public was the weapon. The Victorian aristocracy lived and operated on the currency of reputation. A family's financial embarrassment, once known, did not merely reduce their social standing, it closed doors, it ended advantageous negotiations. It created the kind of whispered knowledge that travels the length of a London season before spring has properly begun. Cale understood this perfectly. He had studied the system that produced this vulnerability for the better part of his adult life. And the particular beauty of his instrument, the thing that made his position so very secure, was that the Duke could not go to court. He could not have Cale arrested, could not challenge the debt publicly, could not force any kind of formal confrontation without the very documents he was trying to suppress becoming the centrepiece of a legal proceeding that would appear in every newspaper in London. The blackmailer's most reliable protection has always been the victim's fear of daylight. Victorian England understood this dynamic, even if it rarely discussed it. The cases that reached the courts were almost always the cases where the victim had nothing left to lose, where the secret had already been exposed or the damage already done. The cases that stayed private, that were settled in money and silence, vastly outnumbered what any official record could show. The men and women who paid to keep their secrets paid precisely because paying was less ruinous than the alternative. Cale arrived that morning and was shown to the drawing room, where the Duke joined him, and Eleanor was not in the drawing room. She was in fact passing the drawing room, on her way from the morning room to the stairs that led to the east wing, when the door was not quite closed. She heard her name. Not her name precisely. She had not been introduced to Cale, and he did not know her name. What she heard was a description. An unusual young woman, apparently, staying as a guest, not employed, not related to the family. The Duke, in a voice that was carefully flat, confirmed this. Cale said something about the timing being interesting. The Duke said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Eleanor stood in the corridor. She was not in the habit of listening at doors. She was, however, in the habit of paying attention when useful information presented itself, and she had spent 4 years becoming exceptionally good at standing very still in a hallway while learning something. What she heard across the next several minutes was the architecture of the trap. Cale was not threatening. He was not raising his voice. He was calm, measured, pleasant even. The tone of a man having a business conversation about arrangements that are nearly concluded, with only a few details still to resolve. He mentioned the debt documents. He mentioned his daughter. He mentioned the advantages of a spring wedding, which he felt would suit everyone admirably. He mentioned, in a voice that became very slightly harder for just a moment, that the alternative arrangements, his words, were considerably less pleasant for all concerned. The Duke said very little throughout all of this. He did not agree. He did not refuse. He gave Cale the minimum information required to end the visit without committing to anything, and then he ended the visit. Eleanor was no longer in the corridor by the time the drawing-room door opened. She was at the far end of the east wing, at the window that overlooked the kitchen garden, watching the morning frost come off the ground in thin, pale sheets. She thought about what she had heard. She thought about it carefully, and she thought about it for some time, and she arranged it in the way she arranged most things, not emotionally, not in terms of what it made her feel, but in terms of what it actually consisted of, what its parts were, and where the weakest point might be. A baronet, debt documents, threat of public exposure, a marriage the Duke did not want, a trap with very few moving parts. She turned the problem over. She looked at it from several directions. She thought about the dower right, which the Dowager had mentioned in passing the previous afternoon, in a conversation that had seemed, at the time, like a discussion of estate income. It was not, she now understood, simply a discussion of estate income. She thought about the baronet's title. She thought about where the title's power actually resided, and what would happen to that power if the right person said the right thing in the right room. She thought for a long time, and then she went to find the Dowager. She found her in the morning room alone, reading with the unhurried composure of a woman who had arranged her morning to contain no surprises. She looked up when Eleanor came in. She did not appear surprised. Eleanor had been at Wyndham Hall long enough to notice that the Dowager very rarely appeared surprised by anything, which was either a lifelong habit of composure or evidence that she knew significantly more about the shape of coming events than she let on. Eleanor sat down across from her and described, precisely and without embellishment, what she had heard through the drawing-room door. She included everything: the spring wedding, the alternative arrangements, the tone in which both were delivered. She was factual. She offered no opinion on what it meant for the Duke and no opinion on what she felt about it herself, because opinions were not what was needed here, and she knew it. The Dowager listened. She set down her book. She looked at Eleanor for a long, quiet moment in the way of someone measuring not what they are hearing, but who they are hearing it from. Then she said, "I had hoped it wouldn't be necessary to explain this to you directly. It appears it is. Tell me what you think can be done," Eleanor told her. She had spent the better part of 2 hours at the window of the East Wing constructing an argument the way she constructed everything, from the available materials, working outward from the most stable point to the most vulnerable. The most stable point was the Dowager herself. Her income was real, legally established, and untouchable. The dower right was not a sentiment or a social custom. It was a documented legal entitlement, protected by the same settlement that bound the estate. Cale could not threaten it. He did not hold anything against it. In the ledger of this particular situation, the Dowager was the one entity in the household whose financial position was genuinely secure. The vulnerable point was the baronet's leverage, and Eleanor had spent considerable time thinking about the specific nature of that leverage and what it actually rested on. Cale's power was the threat of public disclosure. He would reveal the debt documents. He would make the Wyndham family's financial embarrassment the subject of very public knowledge. This threat worked. It had worked for 6 weeks. Because of the Duke's assumption that disclosure was the worst possible outcome. It was not a comfortable assumption to hold. It produced exactly the kind of paralysis she had seen on the Duke's face, hands flat on an unopened ledger, in the small hours of the night. But the assumption rested on something. It rested on the belief that Cale had more to gain from deploying his weapon than from holding it. And Eleanor had been turning this over very carefully, because it seemed to her, and she said this to the Dowager with the appropriate caution, since she was working from incomplete information, that this belief might not be accurate. A baronet's social power, she said, was entirely reputational. It existed in the estimation of the people around him. Cale had spent 30 years building a reputation as a man of substance, discretion, and quiet authority. His membership in clubs, his invitations to country houses, his ability to move through aristocratic society, all of it depended on his being regarded as trustworthy in the particular Victorian sense of the word, which meant being the kind of man whose word could be relied upon, and whose private knowledge stayed private. If he exposed the Wyndham debt papers, he would be revealing himself as a blackmailer. Not technically. There was nothing illegal about holding debt documents or even about making unpleasant offers. But the social reading of the situation would be clear to anyone who knew what to look for. And there were people who would know what to look for if someone put the right information in front of them in the right way. He had used this method before. The Dowager confirmed this quietly when Eleanor paused. He'd done exactly this with at least 2 other families in the past decade. The details were different, but the architecture was the same. He had acquired something compromising. He had offered terms. The families had complied. These families were still in society. They had complied quietly, and Cale had been very careful to leave them with enough dignity to continue existing in the world they shared. Because a useful instrument doesn't destroy what it's applied to, it bends it. Cale's social position depended on his victims remaining functional. He couldn't afford to actually ruin the Wyndhams. He needed them intact, titled, and in debt to him, in a way that continued to pay dividends, which meant, Eleanor said, that his threat was considerably less absolute than he had made it appear. She had not thought about her father's legal practice in years. The memories associated with it were those of an 11-year-old watching an adult world proceed. which is a peculiar kind of knowledge, detailed and vivid, and entirely without the analytical framework that would have made it fully comprehensible at the time. She had sat in the corner of his study on Saturday mornings when he allowed it, and listened. She had not been invited to participate. She had simply been there, which had turned out to be, accidentally, one of the more useful educations available. She remembered his language around promissory notes, the emphasis on documentation, proper form, proper notification, proper execution. He had explained to her once, with the patience he had for explaining things to anyone who was actually listening, that a legal instrument improperly executed was not necessarily void, but was contestable, and contestable was very different from airtight, and airtight was what you needed if you intended to enforce anything in a court of law. An assignment of a debt instrument required proper written notice to the debtor's legal representative. This was not a formality that could be waved aside. It was a substantive requirement. If the original creditor had assigned the debt to Cale, without providing adequate written notice to the Wyndham estate solicitors, and the description she had heard, the offhand despair of the Duke's comment on the second evening, suggested that the solicitors had learned of the assignment only through Cale's subsequent approach. Then the legal standing of Cale's claim was not the clean, unassailable thing he had presented it as. She did not have the document in front of her. She could not be certain. But she had a strong feeling, which she had learned over 26 years to treat with some respect, because her strong feelings about specific things were, in her experience, more often correct than not, which meant the leverage was smaller than it appeared, which meant the argument was available, which meant she needed to go and find the Dowager. The Dowager was quiet for a moment. She said, with a dryness that suggested Eleanor had confirmed something she had already suspected, "You notice something in the documents." "In a description of the documents," Eleanor said. "There's a distinction, legally speaking." "Yes," said the Dowager. "That is, I think, rather the point." Eleanor had noticed something in the documents, or rather, she had noticed something in the brief description of the documents that the Duke had mentioned to his mother in Eleanor's presence on the second evening. A mention made in a tone of despair so profound it had slipped out before he caught himself. He had described the main debt instrument as a promissory note assigned to Cale from the original creditor. An assigned promissory note. Not the original debt. An assignment. The legal chain of that document, the original creditor, the terms of the assignment, the question of whether the late Duke's estate solicitors had been properly notified of the transfer was not a simple matter. Eleanor was not a solicitor. She was not qualified to render a legal opinion. But she had grown up in the household of one, had listened to her father discuss instruments of this exact type when she was 9 years old and sitting quietly in the corner of his study, and she had a very strong feeling that this particular assignment might have been imperfectly executed in ways that a competent solicitor, given an afternoon with the original document, could make very uncomfortable for the man who held it. She said all of this to the Dowager. She said it carefully, with every caveat it required, without overstating what she knew and without understating what she suspected. The Dowager listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "My son's solicitors have not looked at those documents." "No," Eleanor said, "because your son has been trying not to engage with the situation directly, which is understandable but has had the effect of leaving the weakest part of Cale's position unexamined." A short silence. "You need to invite him back," Eleanor said. The Dowager invited him back. She wrote to Cale that evening, in that handwriting Eleanor had admired, precise and unhurried, requesting the pleasure of his company for luncheon the following week, She mentioned that there were matters relating to the estate that she would like to discuss in a general way, and that she hoped the gathering would be a pleasant one. She sent it with the Wyndham footman and the implicit weight of the ducal house behind it. Cale accepted, which was predictable. He arrived on a Thursday in the same elaborate carriage, wearing an even better coat. He was shown into the drawing-room where the Dowager, the Duke and Eleanor were already seated. Eleanor was not introduced as a guest. She was not introduced at all. She was simply there, in a chair to the left of the fireplace with a book she was not reading, in the way of someone who belongs in a room so thoroughly that it would be peculiar to comment on it. Cale noticed her. He did not mention her. He sat down and accepted tea and engaged the Dowager in pleasant conversation about the autumn weather, and the Duke sat quietly to one side with the particular stillness of a man waiting for something to happen. What happened was that the Dowager set down her teacup and asked Cale very pleasantly whether his solicitor would be available to share the original assignment documentation on the debt instrument at some point convenient to him. She mentioned that she had retained a solicitor of her own, a very capable man, she said, whom she'd been working with for some years, and that he had expressed an interest in reviewing the chain of title on the assignment. She said this as though she were asking about arrangements for a dinner party. Cale's expression did not change. He was very good at this. He said he would have to look into that. The Dowager said she'd be grateful, and then said something else, something that Eleanor had written for her the previous evening, precisely, on a piece of paper that the Dowager had read twice, and then put in the fire. She said that she had also written a brief letter to 2 members of the same club Cale frequented, men who had known the late Duke, describing in general terms the nature of the arrangement Cale had proposed. She had not yet sent this letter. She was holding it in reserve. She mentioned this as she might mention a mild inconvenience in the household arrangements. Not a threat exactly, simply a fact about the current situation. The balance in the room shifted. It was not dramatic. The fire continued to burn. The teacups continued to sit on their saucers. The October light came through the long windows in the same slow bars it always did at that hour. But something changed in the quality of Cale's stillness, and Eleanor, from the chair by the fireplace, noticed exactly what it was. He had spent 30 years in a position of calculated advantage, and he had just discovered that the room was not arranged the way he had thought it was. He looked, for the first time, at Eleanor. She looked back. She said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing in a way that communicated something. There was a pause, and then Cale said, very carefully, that he thought there might be some room for a reconsideration of the terms. The Dowager said she was glad to hear it. She mentioned that her solicitor could be available as early as next Wednesday. Cale said he would be in touch. He left. The carriage went down the drive. The iron gates closed behind it. The afternoon light continued its slow process of becoming evening. The Duke was standing at the window when it happened, and he stood there for some time after the carriage disappeared, not quite looking at anything in particular. He turned around eventually. He looked at his mother, who met his gaze with the pleasant composure she had been maintaining throughout, and then, very slightly, let it drop. They looked at each other for a moment in the way of people who know each other very well and have both been careful, and then the Dowager said, "Miss Ashworth identified a legal question in the assignment chain that your solicitors had not considered. I suggest you ask them about it on Monday." The Duke turned and looked at Eleanor. She was still in the chair by the fireplace, still holding the book she hadn't read. She set it down. He had, over the past several days, been assembling a picture of her from the pieces she had let him see. The timber rights question, the precise, unrehearsed laugh, the thing she had said about managing on less. the door she had walked through that he had continued to look at for longer than he intended. He had been assembling this picture without quite deciding to, in the way of a man who has spent a long time not permitting himself to be interested in anything, and then finds himself interested and doesn't quite know what to do with it. What he saw now was someone who had walked into a room where the most powerful person present was a man with debt documents and 30 years of practice at this, and had found the crack in the foundation of his position, not from malice, not from strategy, in the sense of personal gain. From the simple, disconcerting habit of paying attention when most people chose not to, he said, "Thank you," she said. "He'll come back. The legal question needs to be answered properly. That's the part that keeps him from coming back." "I know," he said. A silence. It was a different quality of silence from any that had preceded it that week. After the drawing room, Eleanor went to the window the Duke had been standing at. Not to look at anything in particular. The drive was empty, the beaches nearly finished with their change. But because standing felt like the appropriate posture for the moment and the window offered the most useful direction for looking, she thought about what had occurred, in the way she thought about most things, not in terms of what it made her feel, but in terms of what had actually happened and what it implied going forward. What had happened was that the architecture of Cale's position had been named aloud, not destroyed. The debt was real, the documents were real, the legal question would take time to fully resolve, but named. And the thing about naming a structure in a room, in Eleanor's experience, was that it changed the room. Once pointed to, it cannot unsee itself. The balance shifts, not dramatically, but permanently. Cale would be recalculating. He was a careful man. He would review his position, consult his solicitor, understand that the assignment chain had been noticed and would be formally examined. He would decide whether pressing his claim was worth the cost of doing so, given that the alternative was now considerably more visible than it had been. She thought he would decide it wasn't worth it. Not because he was a good man, but because he was a rational one. The week that followed had the atmosphere of a room in which a window has been opened. The same room, the same furniture, but with a different quality of air moving through it. The Duke appeared at breakfast at a reasonable hour. He walked the home farm in the mornings. He spoke one evening about a drainage improvement he had designed for the northeast section, and not yet implemented because the timing had not felt right. He described it with the attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something and has finally decided the thinking is not improving the situation. Eleanor asked questions that were specific enough to be useful. She noticed that he answered them as though they were the natural questions, the ones any attentive person would ask, rather than the unusually technical questions of someone who did not fit the role she appeared to occupy. He was adjusting his picture of her. She could see this. It was, she thought, mutually appropriate. The solicitors reviewed the assignment documentation on the Monday as the Dowager had suggested. The report came back in parts across the following 10 days, in the measured, careful language of professional men who had discovered something uncomfortable and were deciding how precisely to describe it. The assignment chain had a deficiency. Not catastrophic. The original debt was real, and Cale's claim to it was not invented. But the transfer had been executed without the proper notification to the estate's legal representatives that the governing instruments of the settlement required. It was, in the solicitor's restrained assessment, challengeable. In the Dowager's rather less restrained private assessment, it was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire garment. Cale's own solicitor reached out within the week. The tone was conciliatory. There was a desire, apparently, to find a resolution that reflected well on all parties. There were references to the long-standing respect all concerned had for the Wyndham family. There was no further mention of a spring wedding. By the end of the third week after the drawing-room conversation, the debt had been restructured into a formal repayment arrangement, terms reasonable enough that the estate could meet them across 5 years without material strain. The documents were to be held in trust by a neutral party, who was in fact the Dowager's own solicitor, until the debt was retired. Cale signed. The Duke signed. The Dowager witnessed both signatures with the same pleasantness she had brought to everything, and said nothing that could be characterized as either triumph or relief. She celebrated privately, Eleanor suspected, in a way that was completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The days that followed the resolution had a different texture to them. It was as though the house itself had been holding a particular tension for so long that it had forgotten to notice the tension, and now that the tension was gone, the air in the rooms was simply different, warmer somehow, or perhaps just more itself. The morning room caught more light. The kitchen garden, visible from Eleanor's window, went through its last preparations for winter in a way that seemed almost companionable. The Duke changed too, not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man. But the performance that Eleanor had noticed from her first evening slipped, slightly, and then more than slightly, in the weeks that followed. He began to appear at breakfast at a reasonable hour without being obliged to. He walked the home farm in the mornings, which he apparently did habitually, but had not been doing in recent months, and he asked Eleanor on the third morning whether she would care to come, in the tone of a man who has been thinking about asking for some time, and has finally decided the thinking is not improving the situation. She went. They walked the edges of the winter fields, and he explained, in more detail than she had expected, and with a precision she found genuinely interesting, how the field rotation worked, what the drainage patterns meant for the spring yield, and what he was intending to do with the northeast section that had been left fallow for 3 seasons. He was, as she'd already suspected from his very first answer about the tenant farms, very good at this. Not in the way that a man is good at something because he has been told he should be. Good in the way of someone who cares about the specific physical reality of a thing and has spent real time with it. She asked questions. He answered them. They walked back through the kitchen garden as the frost was coming off the ground, and she thought about 4 years of schoolrooms and about the particular freedom of a morning where nobody required her to be invisible. She did not let herself think too carefully beyond that yet. She was 26 years old, a governess between positions with no money and no name that opened doors. He was the Duke of Wyndham, with an estate and a title and a social world that had its own very precise ideas about who belonged in it and who did not. The gap between these two descriptions was not romantic. It was real and structural, and it had legal dimensions that Victorian England had spent several centuries arranging to be as complicated as possible. For a woman of no rank to marry into the aristocracy in 1878 was not unheard of. It was not impossible, but it was not simple, and it was not without cost, and the cost was paid mainly by the woman. Marriage, for a Victorian woman at any level of society, meant the legal absorption of her identity into her husband's. Her property, if she had any, became his. Her legal standing, such as it was subsumed. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 had begun to chip at this arrangement, establishing that married women could own wages and savings independently, but only wages and savings, and only up to a certain value, and the general situation remained one in which a woman who married exchanged whatever independent legal existence she had for a shared one whose terms were largely defined by someone else. For a woman with nothing, no property, no savings of any significance, nothing but her own capabilities, this calculation looked different. You cannot lose what you do not have. What you can do, if you're careful and clear-eyed and not given to self-deception, is consider what you might gain. The question Eleanor had been avoiding examining too directly was whether what might be gained was something she actually wanted, or whether it was something that simply made sense as a transaction. The Dowager came to her room on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after Cale had driven away down the long beach drive. She knocked, which Eleanor noticed. The Dowager knocked, in her own house, at the door of a woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago as an undefined guest. She sat down in the chair by the window and looked at the kitchen garden for a moment. Then she said, without preamble, "He's going to ask you something. I think you should hear, first, what I think about it." Eleanor said she would be glad to hear it. The Dowager said something then that Eleanor did not expect and found, afterward, that she could not forget. She said that her son was a man who had spent 10 years being exactly what the world required of him. Title, estate, performance, duty, and had done it well enough that most people assumed it was simply what he was. She said that Eleanor was the first person he had encountered in a long time who had not required the performance from him, who had seen the man underneath the Duke and found him interesting rather than insufficient. She said that this was not a small thing, and that it was not a thing that happened regularly in the life of a man in his position, and that she had arranged Eleanor's presence in the house with exactly this in mind, and that she was not, on reflection, even slightly apologetic about it. Eleanor said, "You brought me here deliberately." The Dowager said, "I brought you here because you were the kind of person who would know what to do with the situation once you were in it. That is not the same as arranging the outcome. The outcome is yours to arrange or refuse as you judge best." A pause. "I would like you to stay," Margaret said, "for what it's worth." It was worth, Eleanor reflected, quite a great deal. Not because of the title, not because of the house, but because a woman who had spent 30 years at the top of a social world that did not particularly value honesty had looked at Eleanor Ashworth, penniless, between positions, with a coat mended at the cuffs, and said, "I want you in this family." That was a different kind of thing. She spent the night between the Dowager's visit and the morning in the kitchen garden in the state of a mind given more than it had quite finished processing. She thought about the practical matters first, because that was where she was comfortable. If she said yes, the legal implications were considerable, and she understood them. Victorian marriage law, even with the modest reforms of the 1870s, remained a structure in which a woman's independent legal identity was substantially absorbed into her husband's. She would gain considerably in material circumstances. She would gain the Married Women's Property Act protections for her savings, which were modest. She would gain a household, a position, a place in a social world she had spent 4 years orbiting from outside. She would gain the library. That last point was not trivial. What she would lose was the specific freedom of belonging entirely to herself. She'd not experienced it as particularly large freedom in practice. But it was real, and she had not felt any inclination to surrender it voluntarily. She turned this over for some time, and then she turned the other side over. What she had observed of James Wyndham in 6 weeks of careful observation was a man doing something very difficult very quietly for a long time, managing a situation he had not created, under pressure he could not publicly acknowledge, without either accepting a solution he found morally intolerable or finding a better one. He had done this without cruelty. He had done this without the kind of self-pity that other people are expected to witness. He had read legal history in the evenings. He'd walked his tenant farms with precision and genuine care. He'd laughed, once, at something she said, and the laugh had been entirely unguarded. She thought about that laugh. It was the kind produced by a person who has forgotten, briefly, to be careful. She had learned over 26 years to trust those moments. They were the most reliable evidence available. More reliable than words, which could be prepared. More reliable than behaviour in observed situations, which could be managed. The unguarded moment told you who someone actually was, and who he actually was. In that brief, surprised, undirected second, was someone she found without any ambiguity worth being near. She decided at some point around 2 a.m. that she was not going to be able to decide by thinking about it any further. She went to sleep. He asked her on the following morning. Not dramatically. She would have thought less of it if it had been dramatic. He found her in the kitchen garden at the hour when the frost was still on the ground, which was where she had taken to walking in the mornings when the weather was clear enough. He came round the corner of the wall and stopped, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the particular direct way they had both developed in 6 weeks of paying careful attention to each other. He said, "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to consider it entirely on its own merits, without reference to any practical consideration before you respond." She said she would do her best. He said, "Will you marry me?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the kitchen garden. The frost was coming off the earth in very thin sheets, and the morning light was moving through the bare branches of the apple trees at the far end, and the world was entirely still in the particular way of early November mornings in the English countryside, which is less like silence and more like everything holding its breath. She thought about the schoolroom in Surrey where she'd filed away the word "the Governess" without flinching. She thought about the letter of reference she had packed when she left Bath, and the small trunk and the lodgings in London, and the particular disorienting liberty of being between positions. She thought about Nellie Wheaton, who had written in a letter in 1818 that she had stopped expecting to be seen and had decided to make a study of the view instead. She thought about a man with his hands flat on a closed ledger at 11 o'clock at night, working out how to carry something. She thought about the fact that she had, at every point in this story, said the thing she actually thought rather than the thing she was supposed to think. That she had never, in 6 weeks, pretended to be something she wasn't, or concealed a judgment she had made or softened an observation to make it more comfortable. That this had not somehow resulted in disaster. That he had laughed, briefly, genuinely that one time, at something she'd said, and the laugh had changed his face. She thought, this is not a practical decision. Practical decisions feel different. This feels like something else. She said, yes. She said that she was glad to hear it, and she meant it in a precise and particular way. They walked back through the kitchen garden together. The frost continued to come off the earth. The apple trees stood in their bare November accuracy. The house was visible at the end of the path. Pale stone, chimneys, 3 stories, the long windows of the drawing room catching the morning light in a way that turned them briefly gold. She had spent her entire life learning to be invisible in other people's houses. She was walking back to one now. But the feeling was not the same. It was not the same at all. That evening she found herself in the library for the first time. The Duke had suggested she might like it, in the way that people suggest things they hope will confirm what they have already understood about someone. She went in at 10 o'clock when the house had begun to settle, and stood for a moment in the doorway. The room was long and warm and slightly irregular in the way of rooms that had been added to over many generations. 3 walls were shelved floor to ceiling, the books arranged without the tyranny of perfect order, some stacked horizontally on top of standing volumes, some with torn spines that had been carefully mended with cloth. There was a large desk near the window that was clearly used regularly, papers in 2 stacks, an inkwell recently opened, the slight disorder of a room someone thinks in rather than displays. There was a fireplace on the east wall and a fire in it, banked down but still sending out a steady amber heat, and on the mantel above it a single candle in a plain brass holder, burning with the particular stillness of a flame in a room without draughts. She went to the shelves. She ran one finger along the spines in the section nearest the fire. Legal history, philosophy, a collection of agricultural surveys from the 1840s, a complete set of something in French that turned out to be a history of medieval land law. She found this enormously satisfying. She chose a book, carried it to the chair nearest the fire, and read for 2 hours while the house finished settling and the candle burned down and the fire moved from amber to red to the quiet, dark pulse of deep coals. The leather spine of the book was warm in her hands, worn at the edges in a way that meant it had been read before, many times by someone who cared about it. She had, she thought, found the room that was hers, not given, not assigned, not tolerated, hers. And the feeling of it was something she didn't have a word for, which was unusual, because she generally had words for things. Warmth, perhaps, or arrival, or simply this. The candle went out in its own time. She stayed a while longer in the firelight, in the quiet room, in the house that was still learning to be home. Let me step back from the story for just a moment. The way you do at the end of something before you decide what it means. What Eleanor Ashworth did in October and November of 1878 was see something that the people with more at stake had not seen, or had seen and been too frightened to look at directly. She saw that a man whose power rested entirely on belief was standing in a room full of people who had stopped believing, and all that was required was for someone to name it. She named it, quietly, precisely, without drama and without hesitation. This is not the same thing as bravery in the conventional sense. It is something slightly different and, I would argue, considerably harder to produce reliably. It is what happens when a person has spent enough time in a position of no power that they have no longer any particular attachment to the performance of power. So when they walk into a room where the performance is happening, they can simply not perform it. They can say the thing that is true. They can ask the question that everyone else is carefully not asking. They can name the structure that everyone has agreed to pretend is invisible. Eleanor had been training for this for 20 years without knowing she was being trained. The Chester School, where what mattered was what you knew. The 2 households in Surrey and Bath, where what mattered was anything except what you knew. The market in October, where she had done the thing the crowd had decided not to do, and it had worked. The Dowager's morning room, where she laid out an argument she had spent 2 hours constructing, because the situation required it, and she was the only person in the room who was not inside the situation. You could call this intelligence, it was that. You could call it courage, it was some of that too. But the more accurate word is something older and less romantic. It describes what happens when you pay attention, every day, in every room you find yourself in, without ever quite knowing what you're paying attention for, until suddenly the moment arrives, and you know exactly. Now let me tell you what she saved. There were 43 people employed in the household of Wyndham Hall in October 1878, 12 more in the home farm operation. The head groom's children attended the village school. Mrs. Fitch had been there 22 years. The cook had a daughter training for a position in Bristol. The under gardener was saving against the year he might lease a plot of his own. These people's lives were attached to the estate's functional stability in ways that were specific, real, and not in any ledger that Cale held. They were not what he was threatening exactly. They were simply what was there, on the other side of the threat, living their days in a house that was about to be bent into an arrangement that would have made all of them less secure for years. Eleanor didn't know most of their names when she overheard Cale in the drawing room. She learned them later. But she'd spent 4 years working in households. She understood with the specific comprehension of someone who had been part of this invisible economy what a household actually is. Not a building, not an income, not a legal arrangement. A household is 43 people getting up in the morning and going to sleep at night with the shared understanding that the structure they inhabit is sound. When that structure is threatened, they are threatened. When a woman finds the crack in the foundation of the threat and names it clearly in a room where it has to be heard, they are protected. This is the part of history that usually doesn't make it into the record. The 43 people who got up the next morning and did their work, the undergardener who eventually got his plot, the cook's daughter who got her position, the head groom's children in school. None of them knew what had happened in a drawing room one October afternoon. All of them continued because of it. Here is what I want you to hold before you sleep. She went to that market because she had nothing required of her, and the weather was clear. She saw an old woman being treated badly and said the thing that stopped it. She received a card from a stranger and thought about it for 3 days and went. She arrived at a house she didn't know and listened carefully to everything she heard and noticed a detail in a description of a legal document mentioned once, in despair, by a man who had not intended to say it aloud. She had no idea when she stepped forward in the market that she was walking toward anything other than the end of a minor dispute in a Covent Garden lane. That is how it usually works. The women who change something rarely knew, at the moment they acted, that they were changing something. They were doing what they always did, paying attention, asking the question, naming the thing. They were in a situation that required a response, and they provided one. The rest followed. The rest is what you call, afterward, a story worth telling. Eleanor Ashworth spent her whole life learning to be invisible in other people's houses. She had one last evening of it, in the library at Wyndham Hall, sitting in a chair she had chosen, reading a book she had selected, with nobody expecting anything of her except to continue existing in that room, which she did. She defended a stranger in a market in October 1878. She had no idea she was saving herself too. That is the whole story, or it is the part that matters most. And now, if the room is quiet enough, if the pillow is right, if the light is low, let it settle. The fire in that library burned down to coals. The candle on the mantel went out in its own time. The house settled around her, stone and timber and 2 centuries of accumulated living, sighing very quietly into the dark. Outside, the kitchen garden was frost, and the apple trees were bare, and the October night was complete and still and entirely unhurried. She was still there in the firelight. She was home, asleep now.